What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. What you're about to hear is what I think a really cool conversation between myself and Smith Curry. We talk everything from building a lasting career in the music industry to all the work he's done with tens of thousands of tracks on some of the biggest songs in the music industry, in the country music industry. We talk about the changes in Nashville, we talk about the changes in the music industry in general and country music, and we talk about so many different things. So really hope you'll enjoy this. Stick around. Thanks for watching. Let's see what we got. Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jacob Restituto, and I'm a musician from Northport, New York. And today I have the absolute pleasure of having Smith Curry on the channel for an interview. Really looking forward to having a conversation with Steve Smith. As a fellow guitarist, really looking forward to chatting. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So being a Nashville-based musician and musicians played on, I was doing a little research, and you played on over 5,000 tracks. Which is quite a bit of tracks. Can you give a little backstory as to who you are in the music industry and what you've done in the music industry and just your story and journey? Kind of like starting off as far back as you want and kind of leading you to where you are now.
Sure. I'm originally from the Bay Area, near San Francisco, Palo Alto mostly, but kind of all around the Bay, and was playing a lot of bluegrass dobro, and a bunch of stuff kind of went south in my life when I was 27. I didn't have anything keeping me in the Bay, and a couple of people had planted the bug in my mind about moving to Nashville long before it was the cool place to be, which it is now. And it's, the best decision I ever made. So in 94, 29 years ago, June of 94, I packed up my station wagon and drove out. And Nashville's been amazing to me. I will sing Nashville's praises from the rooftops. It's the best musicians in the world, I truly believe. I remember the Atlantic.com, the Atlantic magazine. It was over 10 years ago. They did a statistical analysis of all the music cities in the U.S. And already back then, Nashville came like hands down winner because it has the talent, the labels, the publishers, the whole deal. And it's really the only place in the world where full band recording sessions, tracking sessions happen, all day, every day still, and, but the sense of community here is crazy. Our house burned down 6 years ago.
Wow.
And the amount of help we received getting back on our feet was just crazy.
That's amazing.
I mean, my phone didn't stop ringing and texts for weeks. People, any instruments you want to borrow, there's yours as long as you want them. People are just,
wow.
People are like, we only have one extra room in our house, but you guys can stay as long as you want. I mean, it was crazy.
That's amazing.
To know that many people. And then, GoFundMe's, benefit concerts.
Really?
Wow. Even you think of corporations being like, blah, but even, BMI, the Academy of Country Music, Music Cares, the union, the Opry, Musicians Union, the Grand Ole Opry, all contributed, 5,000 each or something to get us back on our feet.
That's amazing, man.
Yeah.
They say, it's all about relationships, and, usually that's in the context of, career building and everything, right? But it's really interesting and really cool to see when it's all about relationships, is so much more than that. It's so much broader. It's I think that those are true relationships, not just what can I get out of it relationship, but it's a true relationship. For somebody to donate money to a friend or just give money to a friend is a genuine friendship, as opposed to just a one-sided what can I get. So that's really cool, and it's cool to see that the relationships are broader than just the
absolutely
pocket. Absolutely, that's amazing, man. That's a great story, actually.
It's a cool sense of community here, just in general. I mean, there's some competition for sure. We're all, fighting for the same smaller and smaller slice of pie, but people usually don't let that get the better of them, and, try to support each other. I think, one of my main instruments for years has been pedal steel. And when I was learning that, when I moved to bluegrass dobro, but I started playing steel almost immediately. And so many people were really quick to help me just to, because it's kind of such an odd instrument. And especially back then, there wasn't, YouTube videos or anything like that. But just still as a community, people trying to help the young up and comers and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely, man, for sure. So I'd love to talk about the fact that you moved to Nashville in '94, if I could say this, way before country music was cool. In the sense of country always had its scene, but like in the past, I would say decade maybe, country music has become like everybody listens to like I live in New York, right? It's
Yeah.
not country out here really, like unless
No.
you go going upstate New York in the boondocks, like it's not country, but like all the people know like listen to country music, and like the majority of them like listen to country music, and it's really interesting, just to see that. I don't know if you'd call it a resurgence or just the influx of people into that industry, and not only that, but the fact that country music is now American country music is going global. Like looking at some of these touring artists, that it's not like pop music where it's like it kind of a broader spectrum of the topic of the song. We're talking about kicking up dust and your Ford F-150 kicking up dust in America's back roads, and like these guys are selling out like arenas or stadiums in like the UK. It makes no sense, but it's music, and that's the cool part about it. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on the change.
Okay, so some of that could be the 90s was big in America for country music when stuff was really country, and people view it now kind of as the golden age of country, but stuff sounded much more country than it does now. A lot of pedal steel and fiddle and stuff like that. In the interim, there's been a broad push within the industry to, put a lot more modern stuff in it, drum loops, synth parts, all of that. It has worked to appeal to a broader audience for sure. And so that's a big part of it. And I think, there's obviously warring factions within any kind of genre. And a lot of people are like, man, I wish it was back, with that fiddle and steel guitar and, singing songs about whatever, but what I do like right now is I feel like the genre is broader than it's been since I moved to town 30 years ago. So there are some good traditionalists, John Party, Midland, some guys like that are really country sounding. And then of course, you work your way all the way up to the really pop folks too. And that's what I love is that it's the genre now, there's room for everyone. So I think that a really good development in a time when sometimes it's hard to find good developments.
Yeah. So you broke up for a quick second there. So you said you appreciate the fact that there's room for everyone in the genre, correct?
The genre is much broader than it has been historically.
Yeah.
So you have really traditional sounding guys like John Party and Midland that are doing great. Those guys are at the top of the heap. And yet you can go all the way up to the really pop stuff, which only bears a slight resemblance to, what most people would historically consider country music.
Yeah. No, it's a very interesting transition. Who would you say in the golden age of country would that have been like the Dolly Partons and the Chet Atkins or?
Sure. And I just 3 weeks ago filled in a few shows with Travis Tritt. And he really embodies that, some great classic songs. That guy's still getting after it. He's still got that killer voice.
Yeah.
Well, Dolly's such an icon. She goes from way before the 90s,
Sure.
And now she's kind of bigger than ever, even though she hasn't had a song chart in decades. She's just kind of almost historical figure at this point.
Isn't that interesting how, like, as musicians, we put so much emphasis on charts and placements and all this stuff like that. Like, oh, I would love to get on the Billboard Hot 100 or something like that. And somebody like Dolly hasn't been on there in decades, like you said, and or at least a decade or two, and she's still an icon. And like, sometimes it doesn't really matter, and somebody could still be she's 100% a household name.
Yeah, bigger than ever by some measures. But I mean, it's kind of always been that way. Hendrix never charted, Pink Floyd almost never did. I was listening to a couple songs off of the Fleetwood Mac album Rumors the other day, and I went down the rabbit hole just seeing how the singles that are a huge part of America or the world collective consciousness at this point, those songs are just ingrained in our brains, and none of them, the highest charting one was number 9. Yeah. It was like, what were the other 8 songs? Like stuff that nobody would recognize now. Maybe.
Well, that's what's really interesting too. Is sometimes the number one track just is the number one track for that week or month, and then it's gone. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
It is very interesting to see what has a lasting impact on the music industry, or the world in general as a large. But it is encouraging as a musician that like some of these huge classic names never went like never charted. You know, as a
Yeah, yeah, it's
in
wild.
standards of music, they didn't make it as high as some others, but you know, people are still wearing Jimi Hendrix t-shirts. You know,
Absolutely, yeah. So,
so
um,
you do everything in the music industry in the sense of like in the guitar world, whether it be you know you're still tracking in studio with people as a session musician, but you also track for people online. What do you use
yeah,
to? How does that work? Tracking online, like remote tracking.
yeah, I do a lot of that. Some of it's just word of mouth, and people email me and say, "Hey, so and so said you were the guy," and they'll either send me a Pro Tools session and not just a stereo mix. Sometimes I ask for a stereo mix plus the vocals separately because you'll get something where it's like 90% drum loop and vocals and you can't hear the chords or anything like that. And I'll just drop it in Pro Tools and put my parts down and email it back, and they'll PayPal or whatever.
That's pretty cool,
Um,
man. It's amazing what you could do, and that you couldn't do that in the '90s.
no, and there's a couple platforms like Air Gigs and Sound Better where they mediate between you guys, and so not to get stiffed. But there's also, and also that's how people can find you.
Hmm.
But they're also just don't send them the isolated wave file until they send payment, right, or something like that.
Sure.
But I think this was accelerated by the pandemic. But a lot of people, even in town, will just send me tracks now instead of having me come over. I mean, and there's advantages and disadvantages. Sometimes you lay down a whole pass and they're like, man, that tone's not really right, or you're just playing way too much, or whatever. Whereas if you were there in front of them, they would have just stopped
Yeah.
you after this third bar and told you to do something differently.
Yeah.
But you know, I do a lot on pedal steel, and even with guitar, it's a lot to carry out all your junk, set everything up. Whereas I have, a rig set up downstairs. It's so easy just to log on, just open up Pro Tools, and bam, you're recording, a minute later.
Yeah,
So
it's very interesting because there's pros and cons to both. I'm sure you'd say, like you just did, like the creative process is different. You know, like you said, sometimes it's you can get things done really quickly, but then the downside is you don't have the creative juju, as they might say, where it's like, oh,
yeah,
oh wait, that sounds really cool. Hey, can you try this?
yeah,
Like, you have to like log back into the session 2 days later and kind of try to get back into that track. You know.
yeah, or try to make sure you have the same settings on your pedal board and stuff. That
Oh
can be
yeah.
matching up tones can be a little tricky.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I feel like if you're not punching in the middle of a lick or something, a slight tonal difference isn't going to be noticeable by anybody. So as long as you get close, I think it's usually okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, it depends on the producer you're working for. Sometimes you're relieved that you're not going to be in the room where he's just busting your balls, having you try 1,000 different stupid things, and you can just give him what is best right off the bat.
Hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Most
Yeah.
most producers I work with aren't real ball busters like that, so it's not as much of a big deal. But yeah, so there's totally advantages and disadvantages to both. Usually, if somebody wants to do like more than 3 songs, I'll say, let me just come to you,
Hmm.
so we're not just sending files back and forth constantly or
Yeah.
whatever.
I'm curious in the realms of like pedal steel. Do you find that because it's such a like there's not as many musicians playing that as opposed to like playing, for example, just a standard guitar, is the industry tighter for that, or is it
Well,
is it
so
easier to get gigs? I'm curious on that.
it's a great question. There's many less players and there's many less opportunities also,
Sure.
especially as country has gotten more pop and there's less pedal steel. And then complicating the matters too is like there are a lot people are starting to use the fake stuff like arcade and output and stuff have,
Mm.
or just samples. I got sent a song to track the other day, and it's a great producer and a great artist, but he's like, so the artist loves the steel that's on this demo. Can you recreate that? I'm like, yeah, sure. And I start listening to it. It's the same two freaking licks samples over and over and over again. I was like, bro, I mean, can
Yeah.
I please just do a little more than this?
Yeah.
But also, I think people, including producers, don't really understand pedal steel the way they do other instruments. And thusly, pedal steel typically has been a much slower moving bunch of guys. Like there's a very sense of that the young guys don't have the taste and the knowledge base that the older guys. And so I was like the new young guy from age 40 to age 50, if you can believe that. And for a while, it was just by age with like Dan Dugmore was the oldest, like in his when he was around 70. And Russ Paul was a few years younger, then like Paul Franklin a few years younger. So like the busiest was the oldest, right on down to like
Wow.
the youngest guy who was doing a lot of stuff. Now there's a couple more young guys that have entered the fray behind me, and they're all doing great, and they're all great players, you know.
I'm curious on elaborating on that. Like you say that producers don't typically understand it as much. In what sense? I'd love for you to elaborate on
Um,
that.
well, almost all producers play a little bit guitar, and they're really everyone's just been hearing guitar their whole lives, especially producers maybe that are newer to country music. But yeah, I feel like a lot of producers don't understand the instrument that well, and so they just kind of want to, hey, get me the guy who's playing on all the crap. And so, you know what I mean? Like, I don't have to think about it. Just get me that guy who's on everything. And so that's
Sure.
why it's a slower moving field, I guess is what I was getting at.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with like electric guitar, they want the new young guy with all the cool new shit and all the
Yeah.
energy. With keyboards, it's kind of muddled. Bass, there's a lot of older guys, but drummers too, electric guitar and drummers, they want the young guys. And it's harder for those guys to stay in the game for a long time.
Hmm.
Whereas like for steel, it's harder to get in the game at a young age. Um, Russ
That's
Paul,
really
who was
interesting.
yeah, Russ Paul, who's like the top guy for the last 10 years or something. He's an amazing player, great friend, and super innovative guy. Yeah, he was joking about, yeah, it's the pedal steel, you know, trajectory. Start when you're 40 and just kind of keep ramping up through your 60s. And, you know, I don't
That's too
know.
funny, man. It'd be
Yeah.
interesting. You mentioned samples. It'd be interesting, as a guy that's, worked on everything from Taylor Swift to Jason Aldean to Zach Brown to being on tour with Kid Rock. It's quite the repertoire, and it'd be interesting if you almost create like if you created your own sample pack.
You
The
know,
the Smith Curry sample pack.
so part of it's like, oh, I don't want to be contributing to the demise of the session player. But you know, I saw Nathan Chapman, the amazing producer and musician that produced first 6 Taylor Swift records or whatever, and you know everybody else in town. Super talented guy. I saw him on Instagram talking about he was doing a steel pack. I kind of made a comment or and he called me right away and he's like, do you want to do it, and we'll put it on my website, and I'll give you an extra good cut of, so that may be in the works, I guess is the short
Oh,
answer.
very interesting. Very interesting.
And I, you know, I'm, for better or worse, I think I'm kind of known as the guy that'll use a lot of weird effects and a lot of high gain kind of stuff, and you know, having toured with Kid Rock and Erasure, the British synth pop band Erasure, and kind of done some more of those kind of things compared with a lot of the more country guys.
Yeah.
Um, so that I mean, I think it would be fun, you know.
Speaking of that, I'm curious. You had mentioned your pedal board before, and now talking about high gain guitar playing and funky effects. What do you keep on your pedal board?
Okay, it's the studio board is huge. It's obscene. Um, and part of that is guitar players can use both their feet on the pedal board. And so both my feet are being used on the instrument, you know, on the
Mm-hmm.
pedal steel and the volume pedal. And so it kind of helps to have almost one of everything where you can hold a chord and reach down and just
Mm.
hit a pedal. Or at least that's the way I do it. There's some other steel players who kind of done other things, but I recently got an Eventide H90, the new one, their new kind of double H9, and that thing's incredible. It's a bit of a learning curve,
Mm.
but it is mind blowing. I have the Line 6 HX effects, the big guy, and that thing's, you know, does everything. Um, the guys who I should give a shout out to that have helped me out so much over the years with tons of great stuff are Analog Mike, you know, Analog Man pedals.
Mm.
Um, Robert Keeley, I've known since, you know, touring out there with Kid Rock in 2003. He came out, and it's funny. It's like I'm out in Oklahoma every however many years. I look him up, and his operation has gotten huge,
Oh,
but he's
Keely's
still,
huge. Absolutely.
but it was just him and another guy in a garage when I met him, you know. And he's still just that awesome, fun, kind of slightly nerdy guy who gets super excited about gear, you know. Love that, you
Yeah,
know.
man.
And then Zach Vex from ZVex,
Hmm.
he's helped me out from time to time, and I love it. Such weird, creative.
These guys that you're mentioning, did a lot of them when you were starting off, were they also starting off as well, or?
Yeah, I think so, or at least their operations have grown a lot. But
It's because it's interesting to hear, like, I think that a lot of relationships people kind of especially when you're getting starting in the music industry, like you see like the oh I'm a up and coming musician, I want to work with so and so, as a
yeah,
company like Boss or Eventide or, and it's these already established companies where it's interesting as you're mentioning, it's like you were establishing yourself and they were establishing yourself, and now both kind of the what is it, a
yeah,
rising tide raises all ships. You both
yeah.
now
It's
looking
pretty.
up come up. It's 20 years later. I've done a lot.
Yeah, and that's been pretty fun, and it's been fun to see those guys do well because they deserve it. They're super into it,
Hmm.
and I think that's kind of brings me back to the idea of being passionate about it. And it's easy to be kind of jaded in this industry, especially. I mean, you said 5,000 tracks. There was a demo mill I used to do stuff at, and the engineer that mixed everything says he and I have worked on over 14,000 tracks together. And that's just with this one. So it's easy to kind of show up and be like, oh God, here we go again. But staying excited about it is like the most important thing. And,
Hmm.
for your own sanity as well. Um, but also for just keeping your playing and everything else. And so it's fun to see, whether it's gear manufacturers or other players, or I was just played a show at the Basement here in Nashville, and Mike Grimes, Grimy as they call him, he's owned the coolest clubs in town, still does, including a big old cool record store. And he's the one who books these bands, and he's still just so excited about music, and I
Hmm.
just love that.
Yeah.
I love that passion.
It is interesting to hear. So you could totally feel the difference of the vibe of the people that are, been in it for 20, 30, 40 years, and they still like music as opposed to the people that are, a little jaded, and it's like, oh, you're not super fun to be around anymore.
Yeah, and even as a player or producer, you have to stay current, and that can
Yeah.
be hard too. People have it's surprising how often that you see guys that have not stayed current, and it's hurting their careers
Yeah.
because they don't really get what's going on these days. But I get how that can be hard, but at the same time, there's so much at stake. Whether you're a session player or producer, you got to make stuff sound.
So I'd love to hear. You mentioned a lot of the artists that you worked with. And one of my goals with these interviews is kind of saying like, so many musicians start off saying like, when we start off, everybody says it's impossible to make it in the industry, and my goal is, to show that it is possible to make it, but it takes a lot of hard work and a lot of time and dedication, right? I'd love to hear a little bit of the process of like, how did the gig with Taylor Swift or Kid Rock or Jason Aldean, all these artists you work with, like, how did you start there? You moved to Nashville, and then, yeah, I assume the next day you didn't just start, playing with Taylor Swift. So like, how does that happen?
Yeah, it's you move to town, you start going out to like maybe like jam nights or something, and start just, I guess, a lot of guys would get, Lower Broadway has all those honky tonk bars where people play. So that's probably, I mean, that's always been there to some extent, but that's more of a thing now. And you just kind of start meeting people, and people hear you, and then you hear about a gig that's opening up. So for me, I guess I had been in town about a year, and I heard that there were auditions for this guy, Doug Stone, who was a really big country guy at that time. His first 15 or 16 singles went in the top five. Um, and I wasn't very good on pedal steel yet. That's a long road, and I had only been playing about a year, but most of his songs were ballads, and I could get a good tone and keep it in tune. And I think the last guy that he had was a real dickhead, and they just wanted somebody that seemed laid back and cool. And so I got kind of lucky with that. And then once you're out touring with somebody, you meet the other bands that are on the
Mm,
bill, whether it's at a festival or whatever.
mm.
And it was kind of a full circle moment a few weeks ago. One of the big bands that we opened for when I was out with Doug was Travis Tritt in his heyday. It was huge. And the guitar player is this guy Wendell, who plays the shit out of slide guitar, just killer, great slide player. I was like, back in '95, I was like, man, that guy is so cool. And then, okay, so 3 weeks ago, I was up on stage playing those same songs with Wendell. He's
Yeah.
still there.
Yeah.
So that was kind of fun.
That's
So,
amazing.
I mean, I feel like if you move to Nashville and you're really good and you're good at meeting people, it's never going to be a problem. you're not going to wind up stuck in your bedroom shredding.
See, that's an interesting caveat that you mentioned. The quality of your musicianship is one thing, but the next caveat that you mentioned is another very interesting point. You said you're good at you're a craft, but also you're good at meeting people. Is very interesting. I think that's a piece that a lot of musicians miss out on. They are phenomenal songwriters, musicians, recording artists, but then they don't go out and they don't meet anybody, not even the right people. Who's the right person? You never know.
Well,
you don't know who people like,
and
they just don't get at
meeting people is only half of it. Then you got to like get along with them and not be a dick. I mean,
Absolutely.
If you're out on tour with a band, you're on the tour bus 23 hours a day and on the stage 1 hour a day.
Yeah.
You got to learn how to get along with people. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
you're going to be back in your bedroom woodshedding.
Yeah. I talk to a lot of producers, or actually talk to a lot of mix engineers, and it's interesting, and especially in that industry, in any industry, in the music industry, but like because that is such a, and I guess studio musicians as well, kind of is the same thing, where it's such a you're a service industry to some degree, where like you're there to serve the song. It's so interesting how much they talk about emotional intelligence in the sense of like you have to read the room and know how to work people and catch the vibe, because if you're not catching the vibe, you're not going to get the call back.
Absolutely. And I used to, when I was first starting out, I thought, that's so important as a road musician because you got to get along with all these people but even in the studio, the producer's much more likely to call the guy that's a fun guy and he's wanting to engage with the client, the artist, in a fun and non-combative way and just do what's asked of him instead of like trying to force their, vision on the song, and absolutely. And so you're absolutely correct that as a player, playing what's right for the song is so important, but also just kind of being the right guy in the room for the client and the producer and everything else,
I'm curious.
So I used to think,
I'm sorry, continue.
Well, I used to think, okay, in the studio, you could be a really weird, introverted or antisocial guy because you're just sitting there with your headphones on. And that's not really true. I mean, some guys get away with that because they're either just so good or their reputation or whatever, but you're going to do a lot better. And also you're going to have a lot more fun if you just try to.
Yeah. I'm curious if you had to decide which would be more important, your chops or your emotional intelligence. I don't know your vibe, I
guess. I would posit that neither of those, just back to what you were saying, doing the right thing for the song, and especially as country music's gotten away from the really country sounding stuff. For a pedal steel player, it's your chops you don't have to have really badass chops 95% of the time. You got to find a really great part that works with the vocal, that works with what the electric guitar player is doing, and that sits in the track. And so I mean, that would fall under emotional intelligence, but not as far as interpersonal relationships. So, and I mean, historically, that's always been true that finding the right part is obviously going to be the most important thing. But as country music's gotten away from being really country, you're not hearing these badass chicken picking guitar solos or these real fiery pedal steel solos. Maybe you're padding through the chorus on the steel. So that sounds easy, but finding a part that really sits great with the vocal and really sits great with the guitars and stuff like that, that's always a challenge,
How do you? This is now just a curious question. Blending with the guitars. If there's typical country music. If we're thinking like country rock anthem, right? It's some pretty slamming heavy guitars going on. How do you fit in? What would you typically do to blend in?
Well, sometimes if something's really heavy, I want to go over to my lap steel, kick on the distortion, and really rock out. But at the same time, if there's already 2 or 3 electric passes, a pedal steel might actually cut a little better because of the clean, bright tone of it. But yeah, just finding your moments and hoping the mix engineer takes care of you. I think that's a big part of
it. I heard a quote once. Oh my gosh, I don't even know when, but when I was playing out more, like when I first started playing as a musician, I was out playing just as much as I could, like whatever bill I can get on. I'd be like there'd be 13 musicians, like bands on a bill, and the area I'm from is like a hard rock metal area, And when I was first starting, I was very acoustic, so it'd be like these slamming guys, and then I'd come on and be like, "Let me play my like Ed Sheeran style acoustic ballad." It made no sense, but I was getting out there, right? And I heard this one quote somewhere when I was out, and it was a band is only as good as their mix engineer or as their front of house. And it's
Absolutely.
so true, man. If the mixing
It's a
board,
bottleneck, and
yes,
if nothing
yes,
can
that's a
get
great
through
quote.
there.
Yes,
But alternatively, sometimes if everybody's big and loud, sometimes you go out there and whisper, and people have to perk up their ears and
yeah, I
hear what's
guess.
going.
Or they just walked out because they're
Or
like, "Yeah, I don't like this music."
they just go to the bathroom and get in line for a beer. Yeah.
You know what? I was just talking to somebody else earlier today that like music. If you want to develop tough skin, go into the music industry, man. I don't know if anything creates tougher skin.
Oh, it's brutal. And yet you still have to remain sensitive enough
Mm,
as a player and as an artist,
mm.
to, create music.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, man. It's so interesting. So I just if you're up for it, I'd love to hear a couple more stories. Like how does something with Kid Rock happen, or how does just I think that these are valuable. Just little caveats
Yeah.
of like
I mean,
of
it's one of those things where I guess if I could give advice, it'd be like, I'll go out and play if it's not going to embarrass me or hurt my reputation. I mean, I'm going to go out tonight and play with a guy whose music I love and I'm playing for free. I mean, it's a benefit thing, but I would do it anyhow just to get out and have fun. And then every time you go and do it, you meet new people. People see you playing. They're like, oh, yeah, that guy. And just exposure. So the Kid Rock tour, I was doing a video for this artist, Cherie Austin, who had a couple of big hits in the late '90s, and I guess so. This must have been 2002 or somewhere around there. And the bass player who was on the music video with me was like, "Yeah, I just got the gig with Kid Rock." I was like, "Oh, cool, man!" So I stayed in touch with him, and um, Bob, if anyone ever says, "Yeah, I'm good buddies with Kid," they're lying because he only is, "Hey, I'm Bob." I've never heard him, say I'm Kid. So if you know him, he's Bob. Bob had
very
recently
interesting.
hired a steel player that I don't know where he got this guy's number, and he did a limited run with him. And it was one of those things. The guy had the worst people skills of like anybody in Nashville. I mean, the guy kind of legend. There's people are still telling stories about that guy. And so Bob shit canned him after a few shows and was like kind of almost shut down the idea of having a steel player at all. My buddy was like, "Hey man, get this guy. He's awesome and he's a fun hang and whatever." So
Mm.
that's how I started doing
Relationships, baby,
it.
relationships,
There
man.
you go.
Getting out and
And
playing.
here's like another
Yeah, please.
quick story. I mean, there's a million Kid Rock tour stories, and half of which I'll have to take to my grave.
I bet.
But it was not long after I started with him that he played the Super Bowl halftime show, and this was not that long, just a few years after 9/11, and so security was super tight, and they were like, "Sorry, you can't add a new person that close to the show. It's too much of a security risk." And so I had to sit and watch it on the TV at home while my friends are playing literally the biggest show in the
Oh my
world.
gosh.
And it's just those things happen.
Yeah, it's crazy, man. Oh wow,
Those
that's
things
wild.
happen.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, for
yeah.
every amazing, cool, fun thing I've done, there's been
Wow.
10 things that that I didn't do or almost did.
That's actually really, again, it kind of goes back to the whole aspect of developing tough skin and just kind of brushing those things off because it's so easy to focus on those. You could still be pissed off that you didn't play the Super Bowl, right? But like what's the point? You would have like there's so many like amazing things that you had
Yeah.
the opportunity to do.
It's always that stuff's always going to happen. There's this young girl in town that's getting a lot of attention, Grace Bowers, killer guitar player. She's 16 years old. I mean, she's great and not just a teen shredder. She's got killer tone and taste. She just got asked to do the CMT Awards with Lainey Wilson and Alanis Morissette. And right before she was going to do it, like a week before, the the TV network said no, she's too young to be on that stage, and like
Yeah.
and then she had another got offered another huge touring thing, and then they said the same thing: we can't have a minor on the bus. Like in the space of 1 week, she got these two
Oh.
incredible opportunities, and then
Yeah.
no, you're too young. And
Yeah.
I told her, I said, you know, as heartbreaking as it is, at least you're getting those calls.
Yeah. And how
Yeah.
much better will
So
you be in 2 years? How many
yeah.
more people will you
So
meet?
that
And
stuff's just going to happen. I remember
yeah.
we had a big bonfire party at our house, and the next day I was so hungover, and the phone rang, and I picked it up. This guy says, "Yeah, hey, this is Steve Gorman, the drummer and band leader for the Black Crows. We did like a record this year that has a bunch of the instruments you're known for, and we heard you'd be a good guy to tour with us this summer. Would you be up for that?" And I was so out, I was like, what? And he had to repeat the whole thing again. And I was like, yeah, I think that would be cool. And I hung up and I was like, ooh, that wasn't great. So I called back like a day or two later and left a real chipper voicemail for him. And they didn't add anybody that year, but it was nice to get the call, and it's just kind of a fun
Well, that's
story.
also a really interesting thing about the music industry too. Is like I have learned. I mean, I'm still relatively young in the music industry, so like there's a lot to learn still. But one thing I've learned is, man, nothing's real until you already got the paycheck or like did it, even if it's free.
Absolutely.
Nothing is real until you did the gig. Like there's so many. Oh, I'd love to hire you for this, or I'd love you to play this, or come on tour with this, or yeah, I'll believe it when I see it, kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That is
The artist
such
called his cousin instead of you to do it. I mean, anything could happen.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. No, it's so interesting, man.
Yeah.
I was reading your bio, and one of the things noted was that you worked as a sideman. What is a sideman? I've never heard that term
Well,
before.
just when you go out and play for an artist in their band, so
Oh,
there's the
okay.
artist, and then he hires the guys to come out and play, as opposed to if you were actually in the band or on the record deal or whatever.
Hmm.
So yeah, maybe that's a little bit old school nomenclature, but yeah, you're the side man, not the front man, you're the
Oh
side
yeah,
man.
I guess. Yeah, I guess I see where that
Yeah.
comes from. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I don't know if you'd consider yourself a Nashville native at this point. You've been there for 20, 30 years. But like, as somebody that's visited Nashville for music, a handful of times, it's just interesting to see. Every time I even go, like, it's just that the city's constantly changing. How do you personally find that you're staying, in tune with what's happening in the city? Being that you've been there for so long, like things have changed a lot. So I'd love to hear you just, how you're staying
It's
relevant and stuff.
I mean, it's crazy. People that have moved here 5 years ago talk about how much changed they've seen.
Exactly.
But I'm from the Bay Area, where just bigger cities, and so I welcome some of the change for sure. The traffic, parking, not as much, but
Sure.
the restaurants have gotten better, and just more music. I mean, everybody's moved here.
Yeah.
All the players from LA, all the players from not all, but so many, and I welcome it. I mean, I think that kind of reaching a critical mass of the players and the industry and everything else is, I think man, bring it on, I say.
Yeah,
um,
that's interesting.
I love it, and I feel like the rock scene here has gotten so much stronger, and the jazz scene's getting better as well.
Hmm.
So I welcome all that.
As more opportunities as opposed to competition. It's all,
Yeah,
everything's all perspective, man. Because so one of the
but
things that I struggle with when I go to Nashville, and I'd love to hear your perspective. Like being that I'm from New York, but I live about an hour outside the city, so I'm not living in the city.
yeah,
Um, I go to Nashville and I see, oh my gosh, everybody's a musician. Oh my gosh, everybody's trying to make it in the industry. Like, I feel like such a small fish, and like not every, like you go to a bar and you see 15 people on their laptops with Logic Pro opened up. You see 4 people having a conversation about the show they played last night, and everybody's a musician. It's like not everybody's gonna make it. Or I mean, granted, like success is relative
yeah,
to what
yeah.
but like
No,
a lot of people want to be a top chart, and like so like it's like
it's
it's
crazy.
intimidating.
So I've done lots and lots and lots of rock climbing and mountaineering over the last 30 years. And when you get at the base of a really long, daunting climb, I've done El Capitan and Yosemite several times, stuff like that. It just seems insurmountable. And so you just break it down into, I'll just do the next 10 feet. I'll just do the next 50 feet. And it's kind of the same thing. Don't worry about the big picture for a while. Just focus on being the best player you can. I mean, yeah, you could get psyched out because you can go down to the clubs and just see some of the sickest dudes playing. I mean, Guthrie traps every Monday night at this little hole in the wall over in East Nashville called the Underdog, and it's just this crazy night of like the most sick guitar player you've ever seen in your life. So, but yeah, just hey, I'm gonna go down and I'm gonna like play with some friends and just get out there and be seen and meet some people. And then the other thing is just adaptability. I feel like I've reinvented myself 3 or 4 times since moving to Nashville. I
In
moved
what
to town to
sense?
play bluegrass dobro,
Hmm.
and the bluegrass scene wasn't nearly as cool as it is now. Bluegrass has gotten awesome, man. I saw Billy Strings at Bridgestone Arena the other day.
Wow.
I mean, it's
Wow.
like gotten huge, and the cool kids are doing it now. The women are playing it now. Back when I was playing bluegrass, it was just a bunch of weird old hillbilly dudes, you know. Um, so I kind of started playing more country. And then I was like, man, I want to do a big rock tour. And so I did that a couple times with, Kid Rock and Erasure. And then I saw, I thought, man, I want to play in the studios. And of course, that is, for every 1,000 guys competing for one road gig, then there's 1,000 road gig guys competing for one spot in the studio. So, I mean, that's like a factor of, 10,000 or whatever right there. But it's been happening. And then I was working for a bunch of different producers that were just really clueless. And I was like, man, I can do this. I can do this better than them. And so I started producing more. And it started kind of just with an occasional project here and there. And then I started putting together these slam sessions. And so I call it the Smith Slam. And I just book a studio, book the players, and then just tell everybody, right now it's $400 for a demo, 500 for a release, and you get tracks from a 6-piece band. So that doesn't include mixing or vocals, but anybody all over the world can send me a work tape, and they'll get back tracks from, like, tomorrow I have one. We're gonna do like 8 songs, I think, in the space of maybe 4 hours.
Mm.
I got the guitar player Justin Ostrander that played on the Grammy Song of the Country Song of the Year last year. I got all these players. The bass player Brian Allen played on Jason Isbell's Southeastern record, which is one of my favorite records of the last 20 years or whatever. And we plow through these things, a lot of them in 30 minutes a song.
Mm.
And the guitar player is getting 2 or sometimes 3 parts. The keyboard player is getting 2 or 3 parts. The drummer might pop out a drum loop and then his drum part, and then shake a tambourine or something. And we still get, usually between 6 and 16 songs in a day, depending on how long we're there for.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's been a really fun thing. And so people from all over the world will just send me stuff, and I'll just Dropbox them the files, and,
Yeah, and when you
it,
work with that level of musicianship, like, you can really, bang things out.
it,
Like these guys, they're
dude,
not
that
like,
stuff sounds
yeah,
insane.
yeah,
It sounds so good.
yeah.
I'm 5.5 years into doing this, and I've done, over 300 or 400 songs every year this way, and I'm still blown away at how great. I mean,
Yeah.
we've had number ones in Australia, number ones on the Texas charts, So I mean, you know, how many of our old favorite Motown songs were cut in 15 minutes? Like most of them.
100%, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm reading the Bob Dylan biography, and at first, I don't know if it continued in his career, but like for the first couple of albums, he was like, "I'm not doing a second take. Everything's in one take." And I'm like going back of like the balls, man. Like here I am tracking something earlier. I have like 16 vocal takes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and those tracks that are so iconic, and like figure he must have had it so specific in his mind. That was just a spur of the moment thing that
Who
he just
knows,
popped
man?
out.
I'm
So
curious though, like with the recording industry and the tracking studio musician or session musician, how often do you find bands coming in to record? Like some of these, like artists, for example, like in the country music industry, how much is it like? Oh, we're bringing in a band. It's like a 3-part question.
right.
How much is we're bringing in a band versus like the hired tour band that plays versus everything studio musicians?
So that's a great question. The labels aren't big on signing bands because it's like instead of one drunk, egotistical asshole you're dealing with, it's 5 of them, right?
Yeah.
And they fight, and they just want to sign the one
Sure.
singer.
Very interesting.
So it's pretty rare that a band is actually a band. Usually it's 1 or 2 guys or
Yeah.
whatever. There's some exceptions, but yeah. So first of all, and then bringing in tour guys, that does get done from time to time. Tim McGraw used to do that a bunch. And with a couple of those guys that he would use, there was a lot of editing and stuff going on.
So
No
is that
offense.
it? Like, because for example, like I had are you I don't know if you're familiar with Derek Wells, the guitar player in the industry.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Yeah, I was speaking with him, and he was talking about like how he was playing on Carrie Underwood's track, but he wasn't on tour with her. So like are I guess a lot of people will just bring in studio musicians, session musicians, and then
Yeah,
they'll have their band or
historically, there's like the session players play on the records and the road guys play on the road. And Nashville's always been that way. And there's been occasional things, like I was saying, Tim McGraw used to
sure,
bring his road guys in. But the difference between, first of all, if you're not in the studio playing in the studio all day, every day, no fucker is going to be able to beat you at that. You know what I mean? There's just, you know exactly what works, what doesn't work. With electric players, having 2 or 3 parts that totally lock up and work together. I mean, it's a very specific skill set.
mm-hmm.
And getting the tones exactly right, or being able to do whatever the producer asks at the drop of a hat, the road guys just, with very few exceptions, can't do that.
Yeah, that's
And
interesting. It's very interesting.
and it leads to some kind of shitty things sometimes. Like I remember hearing that Vince Gill didn't get to play guitar in his first like 4 or 5 records. He's like one of the best guitar players on the planet, but they're like, no, we got our guys. Just sit there and sing, buddy.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I have mixed feelings about it, but there's a reason why it's like that, and it's almost. People sometimes say, "Oh, that's why all that shit sounds the same. It's the same 5 guys on
Which is
every fucking record."
yeah,
But
it is the
that's
same five
bullshit. Those
guys.
guys. I mean, I know from producing stuff and being on stuff, you tell them to do something
Oh,
totally
sure,
different,
sure.
totally crazy. They can fucking bring it,
Yeah,
man.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, you
Absolutely.
know, on my sessions that I'm producing, I've done some real cool pop punk kind of things and other stuff, and they can get as dirty and as funky and as weird as you tell them to,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
it's
S-
inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious though, like, just your perspective on this, because I've always found this interesting. Is like the session musician versus the band. Like, some of my favorite music comes from bands, right? So like they always talk about the cohesiveness between the band, right? And like you go get in the studio and you like know what the other person's thinking.
Yeah,
Whereas like you hire studio musicians, they're incredible talent, but like do you like had and obviously it works, you know what I'm saying? Because like obviously the
right.
things are
But
charting.
point of fact, when you hire session cats, those guys were probably on something together the day before and
That's
all week the week
interesting.
before. You know what I mean? They
That's
might
a
have
good
played
point.
with each other 10,000 times more than the road guys were,
Yeah,
because
that's a
they've been
very
doing
good
it
point.
together for 20 years.
Yeah,
And also just that level of musicianship, they
yeah,
just kind of know what to do, you
yeah.
know. As far as like bass and drums together, they'll know after the first pass, one guy will come to the other, or they'll meet halfway as far as like the kick pattern or whatever they're doing. It doesn't take long,
No,
you
that's a
know.
very
They
good point, man. You're right. Especially because you meant like it's the same 5, 10 guys that are doing everything, right? But so that being
it's
said, they're
like
playing together all the time, like a band, like
they're
a
playing
band.
together all the time. Yeah. So
That's an
and
interesting
they just
perspective.
yeah. And I mean again, it's like yeah, the road guys are playing together all the time, but maybe the drummer's always dragging a bit, or they're
Yeah,
just not used to being in studio, and they
yeah,
get in
yeah, yeah.
there and it just I mean, obviously I'm biased. I think there are times where it works out great where they bring in the band and it takes longer, right? Maybe it takes longer, and that's part of it too, economics. The labels or whoever doesn't want to spend money on a bunch of road guys sitting in there and hacking it out when they can just get the badass session cats in there to knock it out
Hmm.
like that.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
but
very, very
yeah, I mean, I
interesting.
think like indie rock records are usually better served as having the band play. Maybe like Americana and Texas country, those kind of bands. If the players are great, and then sometimes there's a thing where they use most of the guys, and then they'll have somebody come in afterwards and fix one of the dudes' shit who wasn't very
Just
good or
not tell
whatever.
them.
Yeah, and I mean that happens with the session players. Somebody's not having a great day, or the guy just couldn't really get what the producer wanted. I mean, I've been replaced by other guys. I've replaced my heroes a number of times. Just it wasn't what they wanted,
Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
the guy wasn't doing great that day, or whatever. I mean, shit happens.
Yeah, I'm curious. I want to be respectful of your time, so I just have 1 or 2 more questions. I'd love to say,
Yeah.
wh- again, how we've talked about how much the industry has changed, how much music has changed. I'd love to hear your perspective on like what's exciting you these days. What are you hearing that's like, oh, that's really cool. That's what I like to hear, or something like that.
Well, I've done some artist development stuff with. There's a young woman, Mia Morris. She just had her 19th birthday a couple days ago, but she's been out crushing it as a sideman for Beth Nielsen Chapman. She's out with the Dead Deads right now, but she's like a multi instrumentalist. And I had a development deal with her that for 3 years where we were writing songs together, and then I was helping her. She was like local artist of the week at Lightning 100, the local rock radio station. And so working with up and comers is really fun. That keeps you excited about it,
Mm.
for sure. And then just man, just I have a couple friends that they're playing on every fucking record that happens in Nashville, and they're still woodshedding like crazy. Like, and I love that, and we try to keep each other honest and hold our feet to the fire. Like, did you practice today? Send a text. And because it's not to sound like a Hallmark card or whatever, but like it is the journey. You know what I mean? You're never going to be there. You just getting better is like kind of the best part, right? I
Mm.
mean, you're never going to be as good at one thing as this guy, but you
Yeah.
can be better than you were yesterday,
No, yeah.
always, no matter who you are.
It's so
Yeah.
true, man. It's so true.
Yeah. I got to be friends with Nuno Betancourt of Extreme a while. Did some work for him a few times. And he sent me a text about, I sent my buddy a get better soon card. He said, I'm not sick. And I'm like, no, you need to get better soon.
That's the best. That's
Yeah.
hysterical. That's actually really funny to
Yeah.
send to a musician. Oh my gosh, that's really
Yeah.
funny.
So,
I'd love to know your perspective on the top of like we've talked about. You worked on a lot of tracks that have done really well, whether they gone gold or platinum. I'm curious if you had to put your finger on. Of course, if you had the magic not like magic answer, you'd be a billionaire. But like, what do you find puts certain tracks at the top of the charts, or put certain artists in the limelight, and some that aren't? Because I've heard some great songs that just don't go anywhere. And some that aren't as great that are top. So I'd love to hear. Just everybody has their own perspective, and I find that interesting.
basically, the short answer is so many things have to line up for something to become a hit. Songwriters in Nashville love to take credit for anything good that happens in this town. And they have that saying, it all begins with a song. And as much as I hate to admit it, the song is the most important thing,
Sure.
just the song. And then the singer, and then the production and the playing. But yeah, of course, like the label has to be on board with it, and it just has to, hit the right spot, the sweet spot with what the public's wanting at that
Mm.
time. But yeah, I mean, stuff happens all the time. One of the biggest things that I ever played on was Billy Currington, Good Directions, and I have the signature dobro part. It was wound up being the biggest country song of 2008, and I had such a big part in it. So, and it was a great song, a great singer. So that was really fun. But after I recorded it, I ran into Billy a couple times in the next few months. I was like, dude, that's the song, that's the song. And he's like, I know, I love it, but the label doesn't want to release it. He finally talked the label into releasing it, even though they didn't want to, and they didn't promote it. And it languished in the 50s on the charts for a while, and the label was just about to pull it, and it took off. And of course, it wound up being the biggest song of the year.
It's so
So, I
interesting.
mean, you just never know. The label didn't
Never,
believe in it at all. you know,
never. It's wild,
yeah.
man. Well, I really appreciate your time. One of the last question I like to ask everybody on these chats is, to wrap it up, what is one thing you now know in the industry that you wish you knew when you first started off?
I mean, I didn't really believe in myself enough at the very beginning. My parents always, they were like kind of supportive, but then like, you got to have a backup plan. But it's not really their fault. Like, where we lived, we didn't know anybody that was
Sure.
successful in the music industry, and it seemed like an impossible dream.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so I would have worked so much harder, so much earlier if I had known
Mm,
it was a realistic, I mean, if we had been living in Nashville and known people, maybe I would have been able to at least see that there was a realistic path. So I know I mean, I don't want to sound corny again by saying believe in yourself, but
it's not just a corny little phrase, believe in yourself. It's, I think what you backed it up with was really interesting, because had you believed in yourself earlier, and had you believed it was possible, you would have done things differently sooner to see that, to make that happen, as opposed to like this kind of wishy-washy potentially. You know, I don't know if it's possible. I don't know. You know, that's a really interesting perspective. So just to know that it is
Yeah, and I didn't
possible and
know
to
if I
work
was
like it is.
good enough either, or if I could be good enough. But if you work hard enough, you probably will be good enough.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely, man. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. If you could hang out for 30
yeah,
more seconds, I want to thank every single person that watches this and made it to the end. You guys are the true ones. Definitely go check out everything that Smith has been up to, all the tracks. And if you're interested in recording with him, I'll have all the links down below where you can track with him either live in Nashville or sending in tracks online. So the best way to support this channel is checking out my own original music. I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a great day. God bless and peace out.